Welcome to Pages and Partners, a Muncie Public Library podcast. Discover the library through our history, buildings, staff, programs, and partnerships. Join us as we explore what makes Muncie Public Library an important part of our community.
Thank you for joining Pages and Partners, a Muncie Public Library podcast. My name is Gabby Sandefer, and I'm the Program Supervisor of Great Achievers at Muncie Public Library. And my guests today are Kelly Batchelor, the Marion Hunt Library Manager, and Laura Geesy, the Technology and Training Manager. These two run our sewing programs at the library, as well as our avid sewists, which is what we're here to talk about today. So, I'm going to ask you guys some questions about your experiences as well as Muncie Public Library sewing opportunities. So first of all, tell us, how did you get into sewing?
Well, I watched my mom and my grandma sew a lot when I was younger. And from there, in 7th and 8th grade in economics, we actually did sewing. And I had watched my mom enough that I was very comfortable with like the sewing machine and being able to use it. So that's really how I got into it, was just watching my mom do it all the time.
That's awesome. What about you, Kelly?
Well, I got really into cosplay when I was 12. And at that point in time, you couldn't really buy cosplays online. I mean, you could, but they were expensive and weren't really accurate, and I really wanted to make my own. So my grandmother knew how to sew. And she taught me how to make a pattern from a ball gown that I wanted to make for my first costume. And from then on, I just continued to sew.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So how did you guys learn, I guess, different ways to read patterns, different ways to, have this idea in your head and make it into, this beautiful creation? How'd you guys learn how to do that?
Mine was just watching my mom. She made a lot more like dresses and used patterns, store-bought patterns. So I learned how to take a pattern and make it into something with that just by watching my mom do it. And then like I said, in 7th grade when we did home economics, they gave us a pattern like, here, make these shorts, and then you're making a little Scotty dog out of the rest of the excess material. So it was just trial and error with that a lot too. But usually if you can give me a pattern, I can figure it out. I am not like Kelly, who can create their own patterns.
Yeah, but I also have a hard time with store-bought patterns.
I want to point that out. That's really funny that, depending on how you've learned as your comfortability, you really like patterns and being told what to do, but you, it seems like, are more confident, Kelly, in, just give me a canvas and I'll create.
Yes.
So I think that is interesting based on how you both learned too, because it sounds like you learned by watching and you learned by creating. And so that's really interesting. I wanted to highlight that. That's really neat. How did you learn the different tips and tricks and stuff, Kelly?
Yeah, so that first project that my grandmother taught me how to do the basics, how to make a pattern that'll fit to your body. And then after that first project, it was a lot of trial and error. My mom and I talking through things, videos on YouTube, a lot of cosplay forums online, and then taking apart clothes that I get from yard sales just to see how the shapes fit together and how that made it lay when you actually put it together. And that's what really helped me understand the pattern making process, which has allowed me to actually make really intricate, weird clothes that they design and never think that they're ever going to be made.
I like that you are, from a ecological standpoint, I guess, finding like things that are used and making it out of that, like giving it a new breath of life. I think that's really interesting, and that it's also taught you like pattern making. And that actually feeds into a question we have here, which is like the pattern making process. How do you guys go about, choosing a pattern or different things like that? Do you just kind of get on Pinterest and see what interests you? Do you, take commissions from people? Kind of like what guides your pattern making process?
For me, I use a lot of Pinterest. So I look at Pinterest a lot. I also, through other social medias, I follow different, a lot of times I make bags and purses and things, so I follow a lot of the videos that are just online that just show, here's how you do it, here's the size you need, here's how you sew it together, and just watch and follow along with the videos. And then I've also used other patterns that I've found offline through Pinterest and things like that, just to create different little stuffed animals and things like that. So.
I've seen your stuffed animals. They are so cute. We have at Muncie Public Library's Marion Hunt branch, we'll have display cases where people can display stuff, and Laura has displayed her both yarn creations and sewing creations, and I have seen those little critters you're talking about, and they are adorable. So if you're ever at the library, try and stop by the info desk and ask them where the display cases are. There's a lot of really neat, interesting stuff there. So Kelly, how do you go about the pattern making process? What is your system or style work?
So what I do, first thing is look at what I'm trying to make. A lot of times I'm making something that someone else has designed. Sometimes I'll do my own designs, but usually it is a character from a game or a show, and then I start by taking out which pieces will make this costume. So is there a jacket? Is there an undergarment? Is there a chainmail or anything? And then I will then break each piece into its own pattern based off of my measurements. Since I kind of know how they fit together, I first start by sketching it out and figuring out about where the measurements are going to be. And then I will go in, and when I'm making and drafting the pattern on like a large piece of paper, I will actually use my measurements in the right place and then just start drafting. And then it's trial and error after that, just to try to make things work.
And that leads in beautifully to our next question. How do you guys deal with imperfections? How do you handle things that, you have this great, beautiful, big image of how it wants to come out, and then it finishes and you're like, that's not what I wanted. How do you keep going, instead of being frustrated? And, I'm sure a lot of our listeners can, empathize with that, where you try something, you're excited, it doesn't work out. How do you keep going? How do you pick it up and, keep going? How do you deal with those imperfections?
First, I find out what went wrong. If it's my sewing machine's fault, because sometimes it is, then it depends if it's visible of a imperfection or not. If it's visible and it's something I'll care about, I'll take it out and redo it. But if it's not anything that's visible, it's not anything anyone but me is going to know, I just kind of let it be. Because everything has an imperfection in it. Even the stuff you buy at stores. I sometimes see seams that are not done properly. And there are things that you buy. And so if it's not going to be seen, I give myself grace.
I like that. I like that idea of cutting yourself some slack.
Oh yeah. Because if you go for perfection, you're never going to finish a project. It's just never going to get done, because you're going to be going over the same line over and over and over again, because it's not perfectly straight. It's not. You just never complete projects that way. You have to learn. My biggest thing is I end up telling people that I made a mistake, and they're like, if you didn't tell me that, I would never notice it. I'm like, but it's just I can't not. I think about it.
Yeah.
But it's you've just got to learn whether or not it's that big of a deal. How big of a deal it is to you, like Kelly said. If it's big enough that it causes the thing to look weird, you take it out and you try again. If it's something that no one else is going to know but you, don't even worry about it. If you, like I said, if you strive for perfection, you're never going to finish a project. Nothing's ever going to be as perfect as you want it to be.
I love that. If you strive for perfection, you'll never finish a project. That sounds like what I tell the students, that failure is the best time to learn. And I think that that's kind of what you guys are alluding to. That's kind of the best, is when a project goes wrong and you can figure out how to fix it. What were you going to say, Kelly?
There's one other thing that I wanted to touch on, because it reminded me, when you're making and you're doing, you're still learning. Every single time you participate in your craft, you are learning more and more. You're getting more skilled. And the beginning of your project, if it's a project that's going to take you several years to finish, the beginning of your project's not going to look anywhere near as good as the stuff you did at the end. Because by the time you get to the end, you have learned so much. And so it actually is kind of like a learning journey, and you can see it in your project, and that's almost kind of fun.
I think that's really fun. I love that idea of being able to look at your project and literally see your growth. As someone who's in the very beginning stages of her crochet and knitting journey, I've already noticed that. In the scarf I'm making, the first couple lines do not look as good as the next. So I think that's interesting that translates in sewing as well. And the idea of working on a project for years, I just want to highlight that. That is really cool. The fact that you guys will work on something in the what's the word I'm looking for? That ability to keep coming back to it, to keep returning. And that's a true labor of love, I feel. So we talked about where we find inspiration, and you guys briefly touched on things that you created, but do you want to highlight anything that you've recently, and recent can be a broad term, that you've created that, you're proud of, or certain things that you create that you want to highlight right now? Because I'd love to hear more about, because it's interesting, you two sew very different things. And so I just love hearing it. We have the cosplay world, we have the, and I've seen your Disney bags. They're the cutest things I've ever seen. What kind of things do you create that you're, I guess, most proud of, or that you want to share a lot of?
Well, over Christmas, I created 4 different quilts. They were very simple 4x4 square quilts, but we got the material, and I worked on making all of them in a week time. It was ridiculous.
That's impressive. I've heard quilts that can take years to make.
Yeah, I don't do all the intricate little sewing over top. It's more like piecemeal and putting it together and stuff. But with that, I did end up sewing my thumb, because the first time I did that, I was like, I didn't know, I knew people could do it, but I didn't know how, and then I did it and had the needle go through my finger, and that was fun.
Yeah.
At 2 o'clock in the morning. That is also why that happened, because it was 2 o'clock in the morning.
You are not the only sewist I've ever heard say, at 2 a.m. when I was working on a project. I find that funny. It's like the night owl in you is that's when inspiration strikes, is by the candlelight or whatever. So I find that fun. That's impressive, though, that you got that. I know you don't do all the stuff on top, but quilting still takes a while. That's extremely impressive.
It still takes a lot of time. My husband did help me a little bit on it. Yeah. He was helping sew and cut some pieces out, because it was a lot.
It's a family endeavor.
The thing I hate the most, the thing I hate the most is cutting material. If you just give it to me cut, I'm happy. I can sew all day. Cutting the material, I just dread it, and so it takes forever to get that done. Because, I don't know, it was 4 different colors and just so many different squares and measuring, and I hate cutting material. But
it's one of the things you got to do, unfortunately. Yep. I feel that way about my hobbies. It's this part of the hobby I don't like, but the end result and all the other stuff I do. So what about you, Kelly? What are some of your top things that you've created recently?
Well, I do a lot of everything. But I think one of my favorite things that I've created recently is a mermaid tail.
Ooh.
I learned how I found silicone that you could actually sew. Wow. And I made a bunch of scales, poured them all, made them, and then I sewed them into a tail that I had made. And so there's 7,000 individually stitched scales onto that mermaid tail.
How long did that take
3 years.
Wow.
3 years. And there was a lot of breaks for several months at a time.
Yeah.
So that I did not set the mermaid tail on fire.
Understandable.
It frustrated me so much. But it got done, and it ended up winning the Masters category at the competition I
That is so exciting, and congratulations, a very well earned, it sounds like, entry, especially the hand sewed tail. That is crazy. How did you make those scales? What were those made out of?
Well, I first started by 3D modeling them and 3D printing them here at Connection Corner.
Oh, that's so cool. Like literally in the building that we're in right now. You and people at home, if you need to 3D print things, the Centennial Library, formerly Connection Corner, has the resources to do this. You just have to pay for material parts. So good thing to know. It's at rate cost, but go on. That's so interesting.
Then I put them all down into some totes, poured some plaster on top, made a mold, and then I started pouring silicone, which is a very long process because they have to cure for like 24 hours, and then you have to trim them, and then you have to coat them. And it was a very long process, and actually prepping the scales probably took the longest.
I bet.
And then, I just sewed them on one by one.
Were they hand sewed or machine?
They are machine sewn. They are a zigzag stitch in the middle across the like bit that would actually be attached to the fish. So. And then the little edges actually come up over top of each other so that it really does look like a fishtail. That was my goal, was to make it look like a realistic fishtail, and it does.
That's awesome. Maybe with this episode we could include some pictures of your guys' work for people to visualize it. If you're comfortable with that, you may not want the public at large seeing it, but that could I think our viewers might want to see that. That's really fascinating. I thank you for sharing that. Wow. So shifting from, I guess, our personal hobbies too, because your personal hobbies have now bled into your work, and you're offering this for people in our community. So, looking at sewing programming at the library, say that 3 times fast, sewing programming. How did the sewing program end up at the library?
So in 2021, Kiwanis invited us to apply for a grant, and I was working in youth services at the time. I really wanted to teach teens how to sew, because that's how I got my start, was as a teen, and the skill has been useful my entire life.
It's like passing the torch on. Yeah.
And also, it is such a useful skill. I can't tell you how many times I'm getting ready for work, I realize something's ripped, I just go into my sewing machine and sew it, and it takes 5 minutes, if that.
Well, I know you helped me at work once when I was in a pickle. I had a cardigan I was wearing that started to unravel, and you were able to take one of the sewing machines and fix it the day of. So
real fast.
It is a very useful life skill as well as a hobby.
And so that was kind of the pitch.
Yeah.
And the grant gave us the resources for basic sewing machines, a couple of them, and some supplies to get us started. And then ECI Classroom Connections actually had sewing machines as well that Joanne's had donated to them back in the day. And they donated them to us so that we could expand the program even more. And then I started doing a monthly program with the teens to teach them how to sew. And during this time I had a job transition, so I was actually outside of youth services, but I was still doing the youth services programming because I loved it so much.
And that's what passion does for people. If you're passionate about something, you'll make it work in whatever capacity, because I remember when you had transitioned roles and you were still doing the sewing program because that was your baby. You wanted to see it come to life. So I love that the passion kept going even when you had transitioned roles.
Yeah, and then when I got back to Mering Hunt and became the adult services supervisor over there, the adults began asking when they're going to get sewing skills classes.
If these teens get them, why not us?
Yeah. So then I recruited Laura to help me with the adults, and we started Fall into Sewing. That takes place in the fall, and then Spring into Sewing, which takes place in the spring. And it's just a 3-month series where we teach how to make a very simple project in each session, and going over different skills that you need to sew by making these projects. Eventually, the teen sewing became kind of a logistical issue, so we had to discontinue that. Yeah. Just because of staffing, time constraints, and the prep work of it.
Oh, yeah.
So we discontinued that back in like 2023, but we do still have adult sewing, and we do hope to continue adult sewing.
That's
in the future.
amazing. Well, and I do want to shout out the last adult sewing class they had was so popular. It filled out, and you had people asking if they could just come watch, if I remember correctly, that our enrollment was filled and people just wanted to come watch. So it is, I mean, clearly a very popular program. I think there's something very special about saying you created something, that like you made it, that you didn't just get it at, you know, a store, that you actually created it. So, and also a shout out to East Central Indiana's Classroom Connections for helping provide those. And you also said it was a Kiwanis in Muncie grant too. So shout out to those two amazing partners, because we wouldn't be able to do this program if it weren't from the Kiwanis grant or the Classroom Connections donation. So that's amazing. So you had mentioned those spring into sewing and fall into sewing. So has the spring into sewing already happened? So the ones that our people can look forward to is the fall into sewing one coming up, right?
Correct. And that's usually, I have to go backwards. We usually do one in December, November, October. There we go.
Wonderful. So be on the lookout, October of 2025. That should be when we start doing that programming. The spring one's already happening right now. What type of projects are they making right now with the spring into sewing?
Well, we just made little teacup bags.
Ah, how cute. I want one. That's adorable. Well, that's amazing. I guess before we wrap up, is there anything else that you want to share as our kind of, you know, beacon of sewing here at Muncie Public Library? Is there anything else you want to share for listeners, either about your own hobby or within the library sphere?
We have a lot of sewing books at the library, and when I was over adult services, I worked to kind of make sure that we had some decent stuff in our nonfiction collection.
Nice.
So if you are looking for like detailed books on how to create things and sew things, they are here at the library. We do have them.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. And we also do have access to copiers too. So if you want to, you know, keep a pattern for your collection, we can also help you with that, getting stuff copied and printed and things like that. Is there anything else you guys wanted to share? Otherwise, I want to thank you for your time. This was fantastic. I loved hearing about your guys' projects. And, you know, it's one thing to see you guys bring them in, but to hear you guys actually explain your craft is very special. So I want to thank you guys so much for taking the time to speak with us today. As always, thank you guys for listening, and keep reading.
This has been Pages and Partners, a Muncie Public Library podcast. For more information about library events and resources, visit munpl.org.